All right, everybody. I thought I'd take us outside on this beautiful spring day. Also, I can't seem to get very good lighting inside today, so I thought let's go outside. All right, today we're going to talk about king cotton. Have you ever picked cotton? Some of you may have. Our community is from our college is in a relatively rural community that usually has a ton of farmland around it, or used to. And so it's really likely that either you or your family members or grandma, grandpa, a friend, a neighbor has actually picked cotton in our area. Cotton is a really common crop in Arizona, and it has some pretty cool history. We won't talk about that today, but it is really relevant. In fact, cotton is one of the 5 C's of Arizona. It's a really significant crop in our state's economy and our political history. But today we're going to talk about king cotton. Who do you think I'm talking about? Who is King Cotton? What does he rule over? What exactly makes him a king? So think to yourself for a moment before we begin today. What is she talking about? All right, so I have found over the years that sometimes it's really fun to draw as I lecture, rather than show you a PowerPoint or, kind of stand and just read out loud. If I doodle along with you and you doodle along with me, I can show you kind of what I mean, but also you get a chance to learn in a different way. So take a moment, go grab a piece of paper, and I want you to follow along with me. I have 8 blocks, 8 squares drawn on a piece of paper or on my whiteboard. Go ahead and do the same thing. So pause the recording, get some paper, draw 8 squares, and restart when you're ready to go. Okay, so I started by asking you if you've ever picked cotton. These are not typical cotton, these aren't pieces that I've pulled off of a bush. These are just cotton balls that I got at the store. But strangely enough, cotton balls look really similar to the way cotton looks on the plant itself. But if you've ever picked cotton, you know that this is not an easy result of the plant itself. In fact, picking cotton is one of the hardest, most time-consuming and arduous tasks that an American slave had to do back in the 17 and 1800s. And there's a reason for that. Cotton is grown on a bush that sometimes can make it to about 3 feet, right? And the seeds sprout these blooms. You may have seen them if you ever like driving over by State Farm Stadium or sometimes down by our campus. You might see these like snowy, feathery plants. Well, they're ready to pick when the plants themselves turn brown and the blooms look like a soft, snowy white, just like a cotton ball you can buy in the store. But make no mistake, this is actually a very arduous task. Pulling the cotton ball from the branches and from the bush itself is hard enough, right? Because the branches, as they mature, get old and like crispy, and they cling for dear life onto the cotton. Meanwhile, inside these little feathery balls off the plant are these sticky seeds. And I don't mean sticky like honey or maple syrup. I mean they're kind of like dry and like they cling, right? They're clingy. So in the 1700s, up until about the 1790s, cotton was not a super popular crop in the American South because it was so time-consuming and human labor consuming in order to get it to grow, produce, and be picked. So it was a really expensive crop, right? So I'm just going to put here under the block cost, just lots of numbers, so you know. It was not cheap to produce, it wasn't cheap to grow, and it was not cheap to collect or sow. Well, here's what happens. In 1792, a guy named Eli Whitney, who was a northerner from Massachusetts, he was from a relatively aristocratic family, and he moved south after college to make a fortune. That's truly what he was doing. He was like, I'm going to move down south and I'm going to figure out how to make my fortune. Well, he's staying as a visitor on a plantation that happened to be growing cotton. My dog might come keep us company for a moment. Hi, Birdie. He's staying on a plantation that's producing cotton, and he notices how much time it's taking these slaves to pick and produce the cotton. I mean, it would take them all day, and they would only produce like small buckets full of cotton, and he thought, there's got to be a better way. So he designed, hello, Birdie wants some cotton. Here, come over here. He designed the Eli Whitney cotton gin. I'll draw just like a general diagram for you. It was kind of a box with a lid, and pretend this is like looking down onto it. Inside was a drum, sort of like the inside of your dryer, and attached to it was a crank. What this gin could do was you could pull all this cotton off of the bushes, put it in the gin, crank the wheel, and it would separate the seeds, those sticky, spiny seeds, from the fluffy cotton itself, and it would make it like 98% faster and more efficient to remove those seeds from the cotton. That means these difficult, frustrating little blossoms are now easier to package and sell to markets that then can do something with the cotton, like make cloth or clothing or fabrics or things like that. So here's what happens. Seemingly overnight, the South becomes a single crop empire. Prior to this, it was really common that plantations would grow things like tobacco or rice or sugar, but those three products are actually really, really hard on the land, right? And so if you have a tobacco farm, you really can only raise tobacco for like 10 years, and then you have to find a different crop. So there was a diversity of crops throughout the South until about the 1790s, when it became cheap and really, really productive to grow cotton. So across the South, you start to see plantations and farms everywhere planting more and more and more cotton. So I'm just drawing a bunch of green to represent that, there's just these rows and rows of cotton throughout the South. And plantation owners are making absolute fortunes. Well, why? Just because you're planting cotton doesn't make you a millionaire, right? Just because you're planting cotton doesn't mean that you're going to get some huge fortune. What is it that's causing these folks to make a bunch of money? We'll get to that in a moment. Here's my question for you. If Eli Whitney makes a machine that helps to separate cotton seeds from the cotton itself, which ultimately makes cotton more marketable and packageable and sellable, and you start to see more plantations growing cotton as a result, is this a good thing or a bad thing for American slaves? Think about it. Do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing if a machine is able to replace some of this difficult work? I think it might be easy to assume that it's a good thing, right? Like, this makes it better for the slaves. It makes it easier for slaves because they're able to use a machine now instead of their hands to do some of this work. And possibly it means that there's less reliance on human labor to cultivate cotton. But actually, it was really, really, really bad for slaves. It was really bad. And here's why. More plantations begin growing cotton. Fewer millionaire plantations, more non-millionaire plantations are grown. So people who are like everyday, average, middle-class citizens, they begin growing cotton too. So the demand for slaves goes up, even though one of their jobs has been replaced by a machine. But here's why. You're essentially constantly paying the machine. The more cotton you produce means the more cotton you can get into this gin. But you still have this part, remember? You still have the part where you have to separate the cotton itself from the branches. So more slaves are needed to work in these fields to get that cotton blossom off the branch and into the gin. Conditions for slaves get worse. More demand for slaves increases, meaning women are typically at risk of violent sexual assault, right? Because their expectation is that they are producing future slaves. It's a really hard, terrible time in American history, and it spans from the introduction of the cotton gin in 1792 until the Civil War in the 1860s. So here's what you might think, and here's what a lot of people thought at the time. The South believes that the cotton industry, which becomes incredibly prolific during this time. This is my sad little American map. Texas isn't really shaped like that, and Texas at the time wasn't even in the Union, but just imagine here's the South, here's the North. The South thinks that, okay, we're gonna solidify our power as a region. They called it a section at the time. We will become more and more powerful because we are wealthy on account of the production of cotton. And we're actually becoming independent from the North. This is what they thought. Let's pretend the North is red and the South is green. Green for cotton / agriculture, red just because I grabbed a marker. It might be able to think that the divisions or distinctions between the two sections or regions become more pronounced because the South is maybe a little bit more urban, right? The South is a little bit more focused on industry, or the North, I'm sorry, and that the South is more agricultural, right? That's what we might be thinking. The other thing the South is thinking, especially as we get closer to the Civil War, is they begin to think, we're too powerful. We make too much money. If we secede, if we remove ourselves from the country, they can't go to war with us because they'll never win. We're too powerful. That's what they thought. So those are the two theories, right? One, that they're separate sections and that they have very distinct identities. And two, that if the South secedes, the North won't be able to fight. Well, both theories were wrong, and we'll see that over time. Here's the first theory, that the North is somehow independent of the South, that the South is somehow independent of the North, that they're functioning as two separate regions. In the North, you have the best representation of something called the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution actually started in Europe, but America gets a ton of credit for it because if you think about like that 19th century wave of immigrants from like Ireland, Italy, places like that, if you think about that sort of myth of American immigration, that's all tied to the second Industrial Revolution. But the Industrial Revolution was a global phenomenon. It's just best represented in the North because Industrial Revolution ultimately means the buildup of cities and the buildup of industry. Industry being things like businesses, factories, manufacturing, things like that. Okay, or technology, although the cotton gin was technically a technological advancement, wouldn't you say? But either way, it's represented more in the North. And I've drawn a little cityscape because in places like Philadelphia, right, or New York or Boston, you have these cities. Skyscrapers are being built. I mean, not the skyscrapers we know of as today, but towers nonetheless. So you've got yourself a little cityscape. But do you know what this could also represent? This could also represent factories. During the early 1800s, you have the new prevalence of factories. Places where you take raw materials, like cotton, right? You take a raw material, you process it, and you create a product that can be exported or sold to other places. So, in the cities of New York and Boston, but also in smaller places throughout the New England region, you begin to see the prevalence of manufacturing giants or factories. All kinds of things like candy gets manufactured, food products, but also more frequently than not, cloth, cotton. So, oh, my dog took them, but the little cotton balls get exported from the South into the North. The North processes those cotton balls into something that can then be sold like fabric and then sells it back to the South or across the Atlantic Ocean. So here's what I want to show you. If this is the Industrial Revolution, the rise of cities and the rise of manufacturing industry, right? There's also something else happening around the corner called the Consumer Revolution. Do y'all know what the word consumer means? Consumption? It means purchasing, purchase power, consumption, to take things in, right? If we go back to the late 1700s, at the origin of this story, the way people made like aprons, for example, they might go down to their local weaver and get a swath of fabric. And then they would use, scissors and a needle and thread to create their own apron or their own pants or their own dress. In some cases on a plantation, you might actually have someone who has a loom on the plantation and they grow raw cotton and they transform that over time into an apron or a dress or a pair of pants. But in the late 1790s, you have the emergence of the first hints of a new consumer revolution where products, things like what we know of as today that we can just order. Like you can go on Amazon and order pants, right? You can go on Amazon or anywhere, but Amazon's our best example right now, or order a shirt or an apron or a dress. Well, just like that, you could open a magazine or a catalog and you could order pants, you could order a dress, right? And you're getting most of that from the American North. So northern factories are producing these kinds of things. Where are they getting the raw materials? That's right, from the South. So the South is exporting their cotton into the North, and the North is producing products like pants and clothing and dresses and aprons, and they're exporting it elsewhere across the Atlantic, but also right back to the South. So remember how I mentioned that one of the theories was that these two regions were different, that they were separate from each other, right? That the South was agricultural and the North was industrial. Actually, as we can see here, that's not the case. They're locked in together through this one crop of cotton. So if we go back to here and we think about the South saying, well, we're going to be our own little region because we have an industry giant on our hands. And you know what? We're going to be too wealthy that if we secede from the Union, they won't be able to come back for us. Except for the North is becoming just as wealthy, just as tied to cotton because of all of the industry. So this cotton begets industry, industry begets consumption, consumption begets essentially what happens. King Cotton comes to control in a lot of ways and influence the whole of America. So I started this lesson asking you, like, who do you think King Cotton is? And now I want to ask you, is King Cotton the crop? Is King Cotton the South? Is King Cotton the North? Or is King Cotton the whole of the United States? Because not just is the North exporting goods into the South, back into the South, they're also exporting these goods to Europe, to Asia, and to other places. So now the South is producing the single number one crop that the entire world is in demand of, and the North is the one that is generating the product itself. So these two regions, these two sections, the North and the South, are never going to be able to get out of this. They're stuck. And the way that we see that perpetuating is as we march towards civil war. But I want you to think about what this means for American slaves. What does this mean for the people who are working on those plantations? What does it maybe mean for the people working in the factories who are likely children, who probably aren't getting paid a fair wage, right? But it's much worse for the American slaves, for the most part, living and working on these plantations. And with that, Birdie and I want to say goodbye. Thanks, guys.